Did Boris Johnson, telling GBNews, not every breach of law amounts to a breach of the ministerial code. The Prime Minister is facing criticism now from his ethics advisor, Lord Gate, who says Boris Johnson's fixed penalty notice may have breached the ministerial code. Mr Raab, though, told us the Prime Minister is going nowhere.
It's only Graham Brady, the chair of the 1922 committee, that will know, but I'm confident that the overwhelming majority of MPs that I talk to want to see us focused on the job at hand, the cost of living, the situation in Ukraine, the crime-fighting agenda, the skills agenda, and so I think it's very unlikely we'll see a leadership challenge.
British Airways has cancelled at least 124 flights at Heathrow, and EasyJet has cancelled over 30 flights from Gatwick today as half-term travel disruption continues. BA says passengers were given advance notice. Well, the airlines are blaming delays and cancellations on staff shortages. The Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, is meeting with airline bosses today to try to find out what's gone wrong. Shop prices grew at 2.8% in May. That's the fastest rate in more than a decade. The British Retail Consortium says the situation is likely to get worse before it gets better, with prices continuing to rise. GPs and health centre staff are facing nearly twice the number of violent incidents that they did 5 years ago. The British Medical Journal says analysis of police data reveals a rise in public order offences like threatening behaviour from patients. Well, stalking and harassment incidents at GP surgeries have increased almost threefold. In international news, the United States have announced they're going to send longer-range rocket systems to Ukraine to help them fight Russian invaders. A US official said the rockets will not be used on targets in Russian territory, but only on Ukrainian land. You're up to date now on GB News. We're on your TV, online and DAB+ radio. Now let's head back to Tom for this morning's briefing.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:33 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, we know that the trials and the tribulations of the Prime Minister have been tough this week, but this week has not only been difficult for Boris Johnson. Sir Keir Starmer has come under a great deal of criticism too. Guardian columnist Owen Jones has torn into the Labour leader this week, who yesterday received a questionnaire from Durham Police over lockdown drinks and curry, over his dishonesty. Jones claims that Starmer ran the most dishonest leadership campaign in history. Let's have a listen.
Here's the thing. Now, I raised this when I mentioned this on Twitter because Keir Starmer's leadership campaign was the most dishonest in British democratic history. Now, people say, oh, what about Boris Johnson? He's a liar. Boris Johnson lies as easily as he breathes. I don't think anyone could look back at Boris Johnson's leadership campaign and say it was dishonest. Like, if he was as dishonest as leadership campaign as Keir Starmer, we'd now be rejoining the European Union. Do you know what I mean? Like, I mean, his whole shtick in the leadership election was get Brexit done. You know, they got their hard Brexit done, which I think is actually a very damaging Brexit deal for the country.
Now, clearly, I don't often agree with Owen Jones. However, on this issue, it's hard to disagree. Let's look at Starmer's 10 leadership pledges. Starmer promised to increase income tax, a pledge that has since been abandoned. Abolish universal credit, well, that's been abandoned. Abolish tuition fees, that has been abandoned as well. He promised to renationalise rail, mail, energy and water, they have all been abandoned. He promised to defend EU free movement, that's a pledge gone too. He promised a fully federal UK and abolition of the House of Lords, doesn't talk about that anymore. He promised to, perhaps most comically, unite his party and promote pluralism. Well, since he promised those pledges, he has booted out a number of members from his shadow cabinet and expelled a good number of Labour members from the General Party as well. It's very hard to see how any of those pledges he stood on have been kept. But does it matter? Well, joining me now is Brendan Chilton, a leader of the Ashford Labour group. Welcome to the programme. Thanks for coming on. I suppose, first of all, why isn't there a bigger fuss being made about the solid pledges that Sir Keir Starmer made as he was standing to be Labour leader that he has since abandoned?
Good morning, Tom. I think really the reason this debate isn't happening is because conditions have fundamentally changed since Keir Starmer was elected as Labour leader. If we remember, he was elected leader just as the pandemic was starting, and the economy of that time and now has fundamentally altered. We see headlines on a daily basis where people are criticising the government for spending more money, borrowing more money, and for the Labour leader now to maintain absolutely every commitment he made from just over 3 years ago, when economic conditions were completely different, I think would be madness. And so I don't actually have a problem with the fact that Keir Starmer is being realistic. He's looking at conditions now and saying, actually, some of those promises that I would like to have been able to keep a few years ago are no longer affordable. And that, I think, is something a sensible and decent politician would do.
See, put like that, that sounds eminently reasonable. And if it were just one or two pledges, perhaps that would be more excusable. For example, the government, Boris Johnson, of course, has abandoned one or two manifesto commitments in the same way. But every single one of those 10 leadership pledges is sort of baying for the left of the party, the abolition of tuition fees, the renationalisation of rail, mail, water, of all of these industries. They've all been abandoned. It's very hard to see even one of those 10 pledges that has been kept.
Well, I think at the moment, the last, just on the issue of nationalisation, the Labour commitment in the 29 manifesto was to nationalise almost everything. But I think looking at the big utilities and energy companies at the moment, as I understand it, Ed Miliband has said they are looking at models of common ownership or sort of community ownership, I think was the phrase that was used. And so, you know, the outright nationalisation, yes, is no longer in that sort of manifesto commitment by Keir Starmer, but alternative models that reflect where we are now are being looked at. Could we afford right now to nationalise rail, electricity, the national grid, and all these other industries? No, we couldn't. We have not got the money to do it. I personally don't think it's desirable to do it, but the money just is not there in the Treasury. Similarly, I think you mentioned a discussion on the federal arrangements for the United Kingdom. As I understand it, again, Gordon Brown is currently involved in looking at future constitutional arrangements that Labour could consider, particularly with the threat from the SNP in Scotland and, of course, now with Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland. So that one is sort of happening, as it were. And then, again, I'd just come back to other commitments. All of those commitments that you listed are big spending commitments. Abolishing tuition fees, well, if you abolish them, you've still got to pay for them somewhere. And so it would require enormous amounts of public money. And I genuinely believe that it's primarily because the country's in a terrible economic position at the moment. We can't afford it.
That does make some sense. However, there is one that seems a bit totemic. It's how Sir Keir Starmer built his brand in the 2 years before he became Labour leader, and that's to do with the European Union, of course. He stood to become leader of the party, promising to defend free movement. Now, about 5 minutes after he became leader of the Labour Party, he abandoned that pledge. Doesn't that strike you as a little dishonest?
I was actually delighted that he abandoned that pledge. As you may know, I was quite a strong supporter of Brexit and felt our commitments leading up to 2019 on the European Union were utter madness. And I think Keir Starmer, essentially, it's realpolitik. He's looked at what those seats that Labour need to win back to win the next government or to get within striking distance. Most of those seats voted to leave the European Union. And going into a future election, with a commitment to essentially have open borders and to have freedom of movement is not going to win back those seats. And so I think what he basically did was realise, you know, the whole Remain Leave argument, the Remain side lost, that battle's now in the past, and revisiting the questions around the European Union, free movement, single market, customs union, etc., would be utter madness for anyone wanting to win the next general election.
Yes, and I know that you have made that case very passionately, and you seem to have won that argument, at least in the short term, within the Labour Party. So all power to you on that. But I suppose, just finally in this conversation, yes, of course, Sir Keir Starmer has been calibrating. He's been looking at which pledges play well with the public. He's been running umpteen focus groups and finding out exactly where he should stand. But doesn't that strike you as something that is incredibly politician-like, for want of a better word, that doesn't stand up to much integrity?
I personally think, I'll be straight up with you, I didn't vote for Keir Starmer. I supported Lisa Nandy when the Labour leadership election was happening. But I actually have been quite impressed with Keir Starmer. I know everyone says, oh, he's boring and he's not dynamic. Well, actually, I think the past few years and the issues facing the country at the moment, particularly with the threat from progressive regimes around the world, I think we need someone that's a bit serious and a bit plain and not, flashy and all over the show. Now, in terms of looking at what he needs to do to win, it was ever thus. Politicians going back to Disraeli and Gladstone looked at policies and they might not have called them focus groups in the 19th century, but they certainly would have had advisors and sampled the population to find out what people want so that they can win and get into power and put in place their values and their other policies. Every government does it, and I've got personally no problem with that. What I would like to see from Keir Starmer, I think you're talking about in the next part of your show, is growth, which is the most important issue in the country at the moment. And I want to hear more from Labour on how we're going to make more in Britain, how we're going to revive manufacturing, how we're actually going to get rid of some of these unnecessary regulations that the government have not yet got rid of from Brussels, how we're going to have a lower tax economy and a faster growth economy, because that's what we need.
Well, Brendan Chilton, it's been a spirited discussion, and thank you so much for coming on this morning. I'm delighted that you've teed up my next segment so very well. So thank you again for that. It's been great to talk. Cheers.
Thank you.
Well, now, as we briefly discussed there, to economic growth, often cited as the biggest issue facing the United Kingdom today. Well, what is it, and why does it matter? We're hearing we may be in for another era of stagflation. Stagnant growth and high inflation, falling real living standards. Many argue that the high tax burden we're now living under is itself a result of lower growth. If growth were higher, lower taxes could bring in the same revenue or even more revenue for better public services. It's clear growth should be higher, but how do we get there? And how did our societies go from being very, very poor just a few hundred years ago to comparatively very, very rich today? Well, that's the question we need to answer to understand how economic growth works. And I'm delighted to be joined by a titan of thought in this area, someone who has written 19 books and holds 6 honorary doctorates. Deirdre McCloskey is Distinguished Professor of Economics, History, English and Communication at the University of Chicago and joins me now. Welcome to the programme. I suppose, first of all, how did we become so rich? A couple of hundred years ago, we were very, very poor.
Yes, you all certainly were, and we all were, and everyone was. The average income in modern prices, in London prices, in 1800 in the world was about $2 or $3 a day, as it still is in the Congo and so forth. And now in Britain, average income in the same prices now is over $120 a day. So that's two or three to 120 is a very large increase, and it's why you and I can speak with this amazing technology we have, and why I'm 79 years old instead of dying at 30, and so forth. So it's an extraordinary and unprecedented achievement, and we mustn't screw it up.
And it's interesting looking at how many people talk about wealth today. Often we talk that there are some rich people and some poor people, and the way we make the poor people richer is by taking stuff away from the rich people. But if we did that 300 years ago, everyone would still be living on around £3, £2 or £3 a day.
200 or 300 years ago, that's what happened. That is, the rich, the dukes and the kings took from the ancestors of you and me, land rents and so forth. But since then, the main thing that people own that provides them with income is between their ears. So what's happened is that human capital, as economists infelicitously call it, has enormously increased in importance, and land, which was once the basis of wealth, resources indeed, are not very important.
And why did that happen? How did we go from a world where for millennia, for thousands and thousands of years, there was basically the same amount of wealth, and then suddenly this explosion in wealth and progress and living standards?
It's extraordinary indeed. And the conventional arguments are that it's either investment, adding roads and buildings and factories, or indeed human capital, or from the left, exploitation. Those are false. What happened was we became freer. First, the abolition of slavery, eventually poor landless men were allowed to vote, then women, then colonized folk, et cetera, et cetera.
So it's been this process of almost political reform
Exactly.
that has allowed us to create more stuff.
Exactly. It's by being free, by having equality of permission, not equality of outcome, not equality even of opportunity, but the right to have a go, to open a shop, to move to another part of the country where it's more prosperous, indeed emigrating. All those were new rights accorded ordinary folk. Again, your ancestors and mine. My Irish ancestors couldn't read. They were unspeakably poor. And now Ireland is the fourth or fifth highest income per capita among large countries in the world.
It's incredible how we've sort of created new wealth. It's
That's
not
right.
zero sum. There's not the same amount of
That's
wealth.
right.
We can grow, we can make more. How do we apply the lessons of the past to the challenges we're facing today?
Give people equality of permission. Allow Uber, such as I just came over to the studio to operate. Allow people to start a hairdressing salon in their neighborhood, which I need. I'd like to know immediately where to go. Allow people, permit, instead of viewing people as children who need to be taken care of. What I'm advocating and what Adam Smith, I crossed myself, Adam Smith advocated, could be called adultism. Now, that doesn't mean sneering at the children or so on, and not helping them when they need it, but it means not treating other adults as children. And all other political philosophies treat people as children of one sort or another. The conservatives treat them as bad children. The left treats them as sad children, bad or sad. We're not children. And when we're accorded the status of adults, allowed to work, then we have self-esteem, and we have, we're free, and surprisingly, we become extremely creative.
It's a remarkable political philosophy. It's one that has succeeded in the past. It's one I hope governments of whatever flavour take on, start treating people as adults rather than children, start repealing regulations and all the rest of it.
Hear, hear.
Deirdre McCloskey, thank you so much for coming into the studio. I've really enjoyed this talk, and let's hope that some government ministers take it on. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you, dear.
Well, now, to a related enormous issue, housing. A new poll by Ipsos for the New Statesman has revealed that voters across all voting demographics perceive a local housing crisis and, surprisingly, support more local house building. By 58% to 13%, Labour voters think there is a housing crisis in their area. And that's also true for the Tories, by 40% to 29%. More interestingly, far from being a NIMBY nation, supporters of every party back more house building in their local area too, with even the most sceptical party, the Tories, backing building by 42 to 33%. So is the NIMBY movement losing influence? Well, joining me now is John Myers, founder of the YIMBY Alliance, the foes of the NIMBYs, those who want more building, working to end the housing crisis, of course. Welcome to the programme, John. Great to have you. Is this good news? Is this a change? Are we seeing the NIMBY movement falter?
Well, thank you, Tom. Very hard to come on after the great Deirdre McCloskey, but I'll do my best. Look, I think it's good news that there's more support for housing, and I hope that's partly because the housing produced is improving. And of course, house building is a critical part of boosting growth. So when we had a house building boom in the 1930s, that boosted growth by about 1 percentage point a year. And there's almost nothing else you can do to boost opportunity and boost wages on that sort of scale, except by building more housing. But we can't be complacent about it because, unfortunately, support breaks down when you get to the nitty-gritty. Nearly 60% of social renters agree that there's a housing crisis locally, but only about 40% of homeowners think there's a housing crisis in their area.
So I suppose talking about this broad support, where, for example, it's 4 to 3 that Conservatives would support building in their local area. I suppose if a proposal starts next door to someone, their view might shift.
That's often the way it works, unfortunately. People worry about congestion, they worry about parking, they worry about whether there are still going to be spaces in the local doctor or the local school or the local hospital. And so I think a really critical part of making sure we follow through with converting NIMBYs into YIMBYs is making sure that we deal with as many of these concerns as possible. So we make sure that there won't be increases in congestion. We make sure that there's proper provision for more doctors' surgeries, for more places in schools. And that, I think, will have a big difference in improving support for more housing.
And so whilst it does seem that housing has crept up the agenda, it's no longer an issue that's just affecting people of my generation. There are so many people in their 40s now in the United Kingdom who can't afford to buy a house, who are stuck in the renting trap. Do parties, in your view, of all stripes, do they understand the enormity of this issue?
I think they do, but they are stuck for options that they can bring forward that won't end up with losing them votes. And so they understand. I think every housing secretary has wanted to build more housing. Unfortunately, many of them have been fired exactly for building more housing. And so they're all really keen to find ways that bring forward more housing with local support. Look, there are many homeowners who are frustrated. They can't do more with their property. They're frustrated with the difficulty of getting permission for green renovations, for example. And so finding those ways of getting local support for more housing, I think, is key to help parties address this crisis.
And just in our final 45 seconds on the programme, what are the ways in which that can happen?
Well, there are a range of ways, Tom. I think one interesting idea the government's proposed is this idea of street votes, where you would let residents on a single street decide to allow additional housing on their street to share the benefits among themselves and with the community. Now, that's a new idea. It's had some success in other countries, but I think it's good news that governments listen to the cross-party alliance calling for trials of that idea to see if it can deliver more housing in a popular way.
Well, delivering more housing in a popular way does seem to be the holy grail of fixing this issue and indeed boosting growth, making everyone a bit richer too. John Myers, thanks for joining us on The Briefing this morning. Well,
thanks,
that's it for the programme, I'm afraid. Coming up, it's To The Point with Patrick and Mercy, but first, here's the weather.
Hello, it's another day of sunshine and showers across the UK on Wednesday, with scattered showers, particularly across central and eastern parts. Still some sunshine in between and actually improving picture across many western areas. If we look at the pressure pattern then, quite a messy picture, but low pressure is still dominating across the UK. This weather front here has just pushed its way southeastwards overnight, so that's brought some more persistent rain across many northern and western parts overnight and still affecting central areas as we start the day. Continue to track its way eastwards, but as it does so, I think it will break up so there'll be more showery in nature with some sunshine in between. Once again, showers developing elsewhere across many central and eastern parts of the UK. Again, these could be heavy with a risk of hail and thunder, but still with some sunny spells in between. But as I said, it's an improving picture across much of Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales and southwest England. It should turn largely dry and fine through the afternoon, and with light winds once again, it should feel pleasantly warm in the sunshine. Highs of 19 degrees there in the south, cooler though further towards the north. As we move through the rest of Wednesday into the evening and overnight, there many of those daytime showers will fade away, and that will leave it largely dry across the board as we head through the night. Again, the risk of one or two mist and fog patches, particularly across eastern parts of England where we saw those daytime showers. But again, with those light winds, it will turn chilly once again. These are temperatures in towns and cities, but in more rural spots, it will turn rather chilly, with temperatures falling into low single figures in one or two areas. So under those clear skies, we're going to have a fine start on Thursday morning. Of course, the start of the bank holiday weekend, and staying fine across many areas throughout the day. We could see some cloud bubbling up, and that could lead to